to a king, and so forth. So it's an evolving process of restraint on the crown, on the sovereign. Now, let's fast forward to 1628. In the 1620s, Charles I was king of England, and Charles and his predecessor James were both, we think, you can now think of as sort of modernizing monarchs. And what modernization meant in the 17th century, political modernization, basically meant getting more power into the hands of the crown, of the central government, and less power in the hands of these sort of great men of the realm. So centralizing power. That's sort of the history of the modern state, if you will. So in an effort to centralize power, Charles did all sorts of things which caused a great deal of ruckus amongst the political classes. This particular petition was issued because Charles tried to raise a tax without a vote of Parliament. And when a group of guys failed to pay it, he put them in jail. And he tried them, and he put them in jail not through a warrant of an ordinary court, but through a court that he controlled, the so-called prerogative court. So the crown, in other words, stepped in some sense above the law or declared another law by which he could take people and put them in jail for not paying a tax. So that's a real constitutional crisis. And the political classes of the realm, I want you to point out, go back and talk about the Great Charter of Liberties, that is to say, the Magna Carta. They talk about the next version of that, which I showed you a version of, right? The second line down. Right? And therefore it says that, and therefore it asserts that the principle of habeas corpus applies, and the king can't put people in jail through these extraordinary courts. If he's going to put people in jail, it has to be through legal processes. So this is what we mean then by an unwritten constitutional tradition, in which a set of political controversies are resolved or are moved forward through allusions to a set of earlier political traditions which claim restraints on the sovereign. Is that okay? So this is the kind of unwritten political constitutional tradition out of which the American founding fathers came, in some sense the French founding fathers too, in the Revolution and other places in Europe, and subsequently, actually, you'll see, interestingly, in the constitutions of much of the world. But this is what I mean by the local unwritten constitution. Is this okay? So, the issue here in this petition, which the king actually signs, it says, look, I agree, I can't take property arbitrarily. And it also says, and this is not a part I showed you, it also says, and this will keep coming up in our courts, I can't declare martial law in times of war. So what is martial law? Yeah?
During Pearl Harbor, during a national emergency, the president can declare martial law, in which case he can take control over everything, he can make rash decisions.
Unusual decisions.
Yeah, unusual decisions.
Right. So martial law is an abrogation of regular law, right, as you say. And in time of war, in time of the state in danger, what the political theorists call a state of exception, the sovereign has an obligation to defend the state by abrogating everything. In other words, in the ultimate moment of self-defense, threatened with death, everything's on. So martial law is the kind of abrogation of ordinary law in this set of emergency laws. That was what Charles was trying to do. He was trying to abrogate ordinary law declare martial law because he desperately needed this money for a group of wars, and put aside the ordinary legal political tradition. That problem will come up again in the course. It's whether you can do it even in a state of war was an issue. I want to remind you, Abraham Lincoln famously suspended habeas corpus on April 27th, 1861, because a group of people from Maryland were blocking the railway line from Washington to Philadelphia, which prevented the North from having access to its financial and population centers. And he said the nation, to defend itself, needs to have these railway lines there, and therefore anyone we catch doing this stuff will be summarily taken into custody. In some sense, the Patriot Act in the Bush administration is some version of a declaration of a state of exception, the war on terror, and therefore the state has a right to abrogate certain sorts of rules, try people in unusual circumstances, and so forth. So I just want to suggest by that this issue about when ordinary law can be abrogated will be an ongoing and important political issue. But in this unwritten constitutional tradition that we're talking about, it says rarely, and it's a big deal, and you can't just do it when you feel like it to the Crown. You can't torture, you can't have people in these special courts, which, by the way, also had special torture, rights to torture, and all sorts of other claims which ordinary courts couldn't. Are we okay? So we went to the Magna Carta, to a bunch of reissues of the Magna Carta, to another version of yeah.
Quick question. I'm just trying to think. Do you know off the top of your head when the last time somebody enacted martial law?
I don't. It was not generally enacted during the whole. I mean, obviously, sort of parts of all sorts of World War II legislation was part of this. I mean, the internment of the Japanese was a part of this. I mean, there people were dispossessed of their property without, in particular, judicial action, by virtue of simply being Japanese. But I don't think there's been a general. Does anyone know?
That's good trivia.
Sorry,
That's probably good trivia.
Chris, do you know? You studied international. Chris had several courses at the law school on these matters, so they looked at him as my expert on this. Do you have a sense? That's interesting. There's martial. You're right. In a particular city, you're absolutely right. There are local versions of that. Right. So that's a sort of the state of emergency when you simply say, "Look, ordinary rules don't apply because there needs to be defense of the polity." Yeah.
When before the Magna Carta was written,
Yeah.
and the individual freedoms, they existed, but they weren't recognized by government, right?
It's a good question. The question, did you guys hear the question? The question before the Magna Carta, did these individual freedoms exist? And what I'm trying to suggest to you, it's a really interesting and sort of deep question in a sense, because until they're articulated, what does it mean for them to exist? So we're getting a little ahead of myself, but what I want to argue is that there have been, for a very long time in the Western and in most traditions, sort of two versions of a story. One version is to be, I'll just signal this because I want to come back to it. One version is to be sovereign, is really to be sovereign. To be the law. You can't say the sovereign's under the law because the sovereign is the law. So if you take the religious version of this, no one is asking, is God being reasonable by asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? I mean, it's not within the rights of children to have your dad take you up and just about throw a dagger in your chest because you hear a voice. Right? But it's sort of a silly question to ask. Of course you do it because God told you to do it, and that's the point of the story. It's the ultimate fate, right? So does the right to life in this sense exist prior to that? Well, then God says, no, I'm not going to ask you this again. Yeah. So then it becomes one of these things, well, actually human sacrifice is not something the Jews do. Right? So it's not like, did it exist before? Well, it's hard to say. So in the same thing, in this political tradition, there is a long Roman law tradition which says, look, whatever the king wants, the king's above the law. And I'm going to talk to you about this in a second. And there's a contrary tradition that says, no, laws are embedded in the culture and habits of a people. And these two clash. So what happened in this case is they had actually a war about this, civil war. And the result of the civil war was saying, okay, let's just for the time being get this straight. You're still a sovereign, and you have all these rights. But on the other hand, you can't do everything. Right? And at least for certain of us, these are the things you can't do. Now, you can still do some things to serfs, unfree labor. There were still slaves in England. You could do things to slaves. I mean, there's a bunch of things where this doesn't apply, right? You see that? But right? It's hard to say, do they exist before they're articulated? They exist in someone's version of a historical memory. But then when you get this document, you get them existing a little bit more. And when you get the next version of the document, you get them existing a little bit more. And that's, I think, very much the history of this whole human rights enterprise.
How do you tell then where they originate? Or is that the point?
Well, that's the point. They don't. I mean, my version of this, they don't. The human rights version, they're just inhuman. But I think that's a kind of incoherent version. This origin. Where do they really originate? You could have a metaphysical view. You say, look, they originate in what God plants in every breast. But nothing in history is followed. I mean, that hasn't taken it very far, right? In real life. So my version of the origin story is to say, look, let's look for origins, let's in history, in particular developments. That's the kind of story I'm going to be telling you. Is that okay? Yeah.
Talking about things like the Gracchi brothers in the Roman Empire, the French Revolution, and kind of helped start the populist movement.
Right. In the Roman Empire, there are these movements of the people versus the Republic. And one of the versions, of course, why Caesar was assassinated was because he supposedly became a tyrant and went against these rights of the people, right? And one of the things that Imperial Rome did was develop a jurisprudence of giving a great deal of power to the sovereign. And one of the things that happened in the Middle Ages, as the Roman Empire and its different legal structures disintegrates, is that power is dispersed. Right? So you're right. And it's interesting you should ask this question. I mean, I'm not going to do it when I give the French Revolution lecture because it takes us too much into history. But there are Roman historical paintings of the rebellion of the plebes in ancient Rome was a big symbol in the French Revolution. In other words, this tradition of asserting rights against the sovereign is replayed again and again and again. The stories of Greek tyrants is replayed again and again and again. And I think the same thing is true in other political traditions when the mandate of heaven leaves an emperor. I'll get to some of that. So what I'm trying to tell you then is that there's a sort of history, and the history of human rights, in quotation marks before human rights, is the history of these kinds of political engagements and the increasing articulation of some of these general principles, which then do become part of what we take to be human rights tradition, the integrity of the person, the importance of the rule of law that everyone is under, and so forth. Okay? So this is the next stage of that in this petition of rights. Well, the rights of whom? Well, I've already shown you that in the previous document, they're very specifically named bearers of rights. And it doesn't include all humans. It clearly doesn't include all humans. And one of the texts that we asked you to read this week is this notion of this debate in Aristotle, is that it is always a bad idea to exercise power arbitrarily, says